Good afternoon, everyone. I am going to be talking to you today about Jürgen Moltmann. I've got the advantage that this was part of the reading this week, so if you haven't yet, beginning on page 557 in Plantinga, you can read about a lot of the things that we're going to discuss here. Rather than regurgitate, though, what you read in the book, what I'm hoping to do through this presentation is to pull in information that wasn't in the book that will help us better understand what it is that we're reading. Context, as it were. The irony of that is that this is one of the things Moltmann is known for. He is much more concerned with context than earlier theologians. So there's a little bit of symmetry going on here in this presentation. So first, let me talk about Moltmann's youth and his upbringing. He was not introduced to Christianity until very, very late in life. As a matter of fact, when he was 17, he served in the German Air Force Auxiliary. And he had the unfortunate circumstance of being in Hamburg the day of Operation Gomorrah. And this is something that I had to dig for this. You're not going to read it in many of our history books, but what happened to him that day was so pivotal. And I can see so much of that in his writings that I wanted to be sure we had covered it in this presentation. So in one moment, he was standing next to his friend, and in the next moment, he was alone. His friend had been completely torn to shreds by a bomb that left Moltmann unscathed. He was standing right next to him. And he told us that is the very first time in his entire life that he ever reached out to God. And he reached out saying, "God, where are you?" Now that's important because as you read in Moltmann's theological writings, one of the things he really wrestled with is how can we reconcile ourselves to a God who would leave us alone, who would allow us to suffer in such a way? How can we reconcile ourselves to professing a belief in that? And the next thing that happened, not even a year later, he was drafted into the German army. They sent him to the front lines. No surprise to me, after what had happened to him the previous year. I think within about 6 months, he surrendered himself to the first German officer that he saw. I think I probably would have done the same thing. But, you know, being a prisoner of war, again, a second experience before the age of 20. That really transformed his life. So he was in a Belgian prisoner of war camp, and he tells us that he was looking at the people around him, and he really couldn't understand why some people were getting sick and others weren't. He couldn't see, he couldn't perceive a difference. But as he watched, he saw that it was the death of hope. From the moment an individual capitulated and said, "There is nothing more to hope for than what it is that I have," from that moment, many of them began to get sick, and over time, some of them died. And so what Moltmann tells us about that time is that he feels that he was spared from the same fate because he was fortunate enough to meet an American chaplain. And that chaplain gave him a copy of the New Testament and a book of Psalms. And I would like to say that Moltmann read them, and it was an epiphany, and he was transformed into That's not how it happened. Actually, Moltmann tells us he was bored. He had nothing to do, and some well-meaning chaplain had given him some books, and so he read them. But what he experienced was in the night, the most difficult times in the night when he was cold or scared, the words that he read came back to him, and they somehow met an emotional need. And he didn't understand it at the time, but it opened within him a longing. We will read about that longing in the theology of hope, because what he experienced was a longing for the hope that Christianity has to offer. And it's a hope unlike any other hope that any of us have ever experienced. So these two things happened to him before he was 20 years old. Then, when the war ends and he is released, he goes to university. There's been no experience with Christianity up to this point. He goes to university, decides to study theology, and he begins with professors who were acolytes of Karl Barth. He attended Gothenburg University, and in Germany, that was where Karl Barth had a strong foothold. So this is where he began theology, in Barth. And over time, he tells us that he got frustrated with Barth's dialectical approach because it didn't consider the context. For him, we can't discuss reality unless we also call to mind the biases we have in interpreting that reality. So whether it was our upbringing or our socioeconomic status or our politics, reality is inherently shaped by things that we can't see and maybe don't even realize exist. So out of that frustration, he began to read Bonhoeffer, and he studied further. Ironically, working backwards, many of the insights from Kant and Hegel are pulled into the works that we see from Moltmann later on. But he worked in the reverse of how we are studying and in the reverse of the theological timeline. So very quickly about his theology. He is what we would call a context theologian rather than a process theologian. And what I mean by that is he's much more concerned about the contents of the theology rather than the process through which it is illuminated. So what do I mean by content? If we're talking about theological revision, what we're going to hear from Moltmann is how that relates to its biblical origin. So if we are revising theology, what is it about the Bible that tells us the theology is accurate or that the theology needed to be changed? He also speaks of theological innovation, not in terms of a theology having been incomplete. For him, God is complete. God is whole. Theological innovation occurs when something is going on within our current circumstance that causes us to have to revisit how we have understood God previously. So that's how a content theologian may be thinking about theology, as opposed to a process theologian who would talk about how the thought had developed over time. So hopefully that helps you there. In terms of his writing, I really only want to spend time on the first 3 books. So you can think about his writing in 2 phases. The first phase was a 3-book trilogy. And then the second phase is more of the systematic work that he did, really pulling back the biases, the unknown biases that we have within specific portions of theology. So I did want to spend just a quick few minutes talking about this trilogy. The Theology of Hope is the book that he is most well known for. And as I shared with you, it's more than hope. When he thinks about the end, when he thinks about eschatology, it's more than a hope that it's going to be over. It's the hope that we are going to have a new beginning, that we are going to experience the culmination of God's plan, and that we will be doing it with our loving Father who has been with us and who has suffered with us along the way. So the second book in the trilogy, called The Crucified God, that really gets into that suffering and how it is through the cross that we can open ourselves up, that we can share our suffering with God, and we are sharing it with a God who cares and understands. The final book in this trilogy is really how he pulled those 2 views together for the church. So in light of hope, in light of suffering, how can the church communicate with the help of the Holy Spirit? How can the church communicate this to society? So these are some of the legacies that Moltmann has to offer. He is a professor to this day. I was thinking about his age. He's got to be up there in his 90s now. But this is what we have gained from Moltmann and his theology, a fresh way of thinking about things, and I think a theology that is more holistic and more inclusive of the person, the environment, all of the various and beautiful aspects of the world that God has given us.